Hello and welcome. I'm Praveer, and today's session is Sensing the Emergence of New Structure in Matter and Life and its impact on physics, chemistry, and biology in light-based quantum computational model. So over the next 20 to 30 minutes, I'm going to first begin with a conceptual key. The heart of this key is a fourfold quantum computational model of light. So I'll speak about the different layers in light and how that in this model is responsible for all the emergence of matter in life. Implicit in this fourfold quantum computational model of light is a fifth construct, which I'll then highlight. And this will lead to a discussion on sensing the fivefold structure of molecular plans and cells, and then subsequently of periodic table, of quantum particles, of the electromagnetic spectrum, and I'll conclude with some thoughts on the impact on physics, chemistry, and biology. So to begin with the conceptual key, the heart of this is that we have a fourfold model of light that prototypes cosmos as a complex adaptive system. So this mathematical formulation here, which is a symmetrical fourfold model of light, has essential layers that in the next slide I'm going to go into in more detail. But you'll see here that there are four essential layers: light in a conceptual space traveling infinitely fast, finally getting projected at the speed that we know in the physical universe of 186,000 miles per second. There's different mechanisms of quantization, and that's represented here by the down arrows. So what you see here is, again, a fourfold symmetrical model of light having four essential layers connected together by mechanisms of quantization. And this represents the cosmos, as I'll show in a few minutes. In this model, all surfacings of matter and life are seen as fourfold constructs whose architecture is determined by the four properties of light. So what we'll see is that everything that emerges, whether electromagnetic spectrum, quantum particles, atoms, molecular plans, cells, the architecture of this is all determined, again, by this fourfoldness that's implicit in this model of light. And regardless of the layer in which it shows up, or the output of this computational matrix, there's a symmetry that's maintained, again, both in the structure and in the output. There's an iterative computational nature of the model, and based on a system of feedback loops, this indicates a potential or future phase. And this phase essentially kicks in when this highest conceptual layer is able to reflect itself more fully in the layer of material manifestation. When this occurs, then the system, as it were, morphs, and the fourfoldness yields to a fivefoldness. So there's an implicit property in this fourfoldness that reveals itself when this condition is met. And as a result of that, outputs, whether of molecular plans or atoms or quantum particles and so on, also begin to reveal a fifth aspect. So that's the conceptual key. Let's have a deeper dive into what this model is about. So the heart of this is a fourfold quantum computational model of light. The way to think about this is, let's start from the top layer over here and imagine light traveling infinitely fast. Now, regardless of the size of volume, it might be it. So whether it's a room or a galaxy or a universe, if light's traveling infinitely fast, then it's going to be instantaneously present everywhere. So we have this property, implicit property of presence. If anything not the nature of light were to arise, it would be overpowered by the nature of light. And so there's this implicit property of power in light. Anything that arises or disappears will do so in the fabric of light and gets recorded in a sense in that light. So the light has a knowledge of everything happening in its quote unquote space. Therefore, it has a knowledge, there's an implicit property of knowledge. And since everything is happening in the substance of light, there's an implicit harmony that exists. So therefore, the properties of this layer of existence that's occurring when light travels infinitely fast is summarized by a set that we call presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. Now, due to an act of quantization that's represented by this layer over here, this infinitely fast moving layer begins to differentiate itself. So it projects itself at a slower speed by which that quantization or differentiation can occur. And these properties that may be more ambiguous or conceptual, or presence, power, knowledge, harmony, become more clear and manifest as four large sets. There's a set of presence, a set of power, a set of knowledge, and a set of harmony that contain up to infinite elements in each set. Now, there's a further act of quantization where light projects itself at a slower speed, and there's therefore further differentiation that then occurs. And this differentiation is summarized by this mathematical formulation that essentially suggests that there are going to be an infinite number of subtle seeds, and each seed is unique, being determined by some unique combination of properties or elements that exist in these four large sets. So we have here a layer that is yet faster than the known speed of 186,000 miles per second, but has been projected from this conceptual space of light traveling infinitely fast. And it shows up as an infinite number of subtle seeds. Now, as there's a next quantization that occurs, then light projects itself at the known speed of 186,000 miles per second. And these infinite number of subtle seeds then form the substance of what we call space. So there's a granularity to space. The process by which each of these subtle seeds materializes can be variable, but is encapsulated by this cosmic property of time. The transformation from something subtle to something material in the cosmos is summarized by this property of energy, and the arrangement of seeds and seeds, which is natural in any material manifestation, is summarized by this cosmic property of gravity. When we look at space-time energy gravity in the cosmos, then we can also see that since space contains archetypes of everything that will arise, it's a carrier or a face of knowledge. Since the concept or the idea that's contained in each seed will manifest through the passage of time, regardless of obstacle, time, therefore, can be seen as a face, a symmetrical face of power. Energy can be seen as a symmetrical face of presence, whereby that thing that's subtle becomes present. And gravity can be seen as a symmetrical face of harmony, whereby there's a certain arrangement between seed and seeds and seeds that's maintained. Therefore, the cosmos, in its first formulation, in the parameters that we recognize as being instrumental to its operation are space-time energy gravity, and nothing other in this model of light as a symmetrical face of these four implicit properties that we're calling presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. Now, this is a computational model. It will be seen that it's in a state of persistent computation, and in its iterations, it creates the layers of matter and life that we're familiar with. So starting with the electromagnetic spectrum, quantum particles, atoms, molecules, molecular plants, cells, and each of these can also be shown as having this fourfold symmetry as a foundation of its architecture. Now, if we observe the manifestation of any of these layers of existence, the material and the life layers, it becomes clear that in order for life to express itself, for example, when we look at a cell, there's four molecular plans that animate the cell that all have to act in unity. And therefore, it becomes clear that there's a unity that will accompany these four powers or these four faces of light. And this has to be because when we look at the aspect of this conceptual layer where light's traveling infinitely fast, we see that this presence, power, knowledge, harmony is all merged together. So there's an implicit convergence over here. And in this fivefold model of light, or where this fifth construct comes into being, that implicit property becomes explicit. So not only in the conceptual layer where light is traveling infinitely fast, but subsequently there is created a set of convergence. Every subtle seed that's created now also derives from properties of this set of convergence. And at the level of cosmic parameters, they're suggested to be, or this predicted to be, as per this model, a property of quintergence that will alter the physics of space-time, energy, and gravity so that these act as a more unified embryo within which dynamics suggested by the antecedent layers can be more materially reflected at the material level. And so this fifth construct, again, the condition for its appearance is when the initial fourfoldness that exists in the layer created when light is imagined to exist infinitely fast, when the properties of that layer can reflect themselves more fully in the material layer, then that mechanism of feedback makes what's implicit more explicit in structure and in the architecture of all its emergence. So let's start with the most granular level, and this is that of cells. And cells, we know today, regardless of the type of cell, whether it's a human cell or animal cell or a plant cell, has four molecular plans. And we refer to these four molecular plans as nucleic acids, proteins, lipids, and polysaccharides. And in investigating the essence of what nucleic acid stands for, we can see it to be a symmetrical face of knowledge, because nucleic acids, after all, create the DNA, it creates a library of information in the cells by which every component in the cell has its instructions on how to behave and how to interact with the world around it. In considering proteins, it's a symmetrical face of presence. If you consider the human cell, there are over 30,000 different proteins that exist for all kind of functionality, as catalysts, as enzymes, as mechanical motors. They're present right through the cell in every of its operations. When we think about lipids, it's a symmetrical face of harmony, because lipids create natural compartments in cells that allow work specialization and harmony to occur. And when we think about polysaccharides, they are a symmetrical face of power, because these chains of sugar provide energy for various activities in the cell. So we see that the four known molecular plans, regardless of the type of living cell, are nothing other than a symmetrical face of light's properties of knowledge, presence, harmony, and power. And what this model is suggesting is that beyond the capabilities that already exist in any living cell, there's the potential for an emergence of a fifth kind of molecular plan that would endow the cell with extraordinary capabilities, such as allowing different kinds of combinations between cells, shape-shifting, expansion, lightness, heaviness, and so on. And this fifth molecular plan in this model has been called the Ananda molecular plan. And to make it possible, obviously, the structure of molecules themselves has to go through a change also predicted by this fivefold mathematical model. Because if we look at the periodic table today, we know that any atom can be classified into one of four categories. These are P shell, D shell, S shell, and F shell. And if we consider the essence of what these different classes in the periodic table stand for, starting, for example, with hydrogen and helium that are part of the S shell group, we know that these atoms are responsible for fusion, fission, basically for powering of suns, and we can intuit that they are a symmetrical face of power. When we think about F shell atoms, we know that this is an experimentation collectivity. We have atoms with the highest atomic number, and therefore it's a symmetrical face of harmony. When we think about the D shell atoms, we know that this is a symmetrical face of presence, because in the material infrastructure, for instance, it is constituted by such elements as iron, nickel, cobalt, aluminum, steel, and so on, that allow this infrastructure and presence to be created. And therefore, we can intuit that D shell atoms are a symmetrical face of presence. And similarly, if you look at the P shell atoms, we have not only archetypes of different categories of atoms in this group, but also we have elements such as carbon and silicon that we know are at the base of thinking, natural life, and quote unquote thinking computational creations as well. So we can intuit that this is a symmetrical phase of knowledge. But what's being predicted here, and this has to be if what we have is the Anandam molecular plans, it has to be created by a much larger combination of potential molecules, which would require that current chemical transactions are transcended and that atoms can combine in many, many more ways than currently. And this would necessitate a fifth kind of atom that I'm calling here the A shell atoms, that would also be a symmetrical phase of convergence. And this would itself be facilitated by a fifth kind of quantum particle that would allow many, many more kinds of atoms to come into existence. And this here is called the Amaran particle, that in this model is an emergent phase of the fifth property of convergence. And it complements the other four categories of quantum particles that we know as quarks, leptons, bosons, and the Higgs boson. If we consider what these classes of quantum particles stand for, we can say that quarks is a symmetrical phase of knowledge, because if we think about the proton, which determines the atomic number, and the atomic number we know will determine the behavior of an element, then we can see that the proton is entirely constituted by quarks. And so that gives us a sense that quarks is a symmetrical phase, or could be a symmetrical phase for knowledge. We know in looking at leptons and considering the electron as a surrogate for the lepton, that the release or capture of electrons is always accompanied by power and energy. And so we can intuit that leptons is a symmetrical phase of power. Similarly, we can intuit that bosons are symmetrical phase of harmony, since bosons are required for any kind of combination or interaction at the quantum particle level. And anything that has mass, any quantum particle that has mass, has to interact with the Higgs field via the Higgs boson, and therefore the Higgs boson becomes a symmetrical phase of presence. So we see that that fourfoldness that already determines the structure of quantum particles as we know today. In this model, we'll also allow a fifth particle called the Amaran particle to come into existence, that in turn would allow quantum particles to combine in different ways, creating a whole host of new atoms that then facilitates a whole host of possible chemical combinations, creating molecules that in turn allows the Anandam molecular plan to come into being. But as we project back to a final level of granularity, we can also suggest that the electromagnetic spectrum is also a symmetrical phase of light, and that this model with the fifth construct is suggesting a fifth property to that electromagnetic spectrum. But what are the four properties already existent in it? Of course, electromagnetic has clearly two aspects that are reflected in its name, and the electro can be related to power and magnetic to harmony. And when we think about power, then we know that the frequency of a photon will determine the amount of power that it has. And so the frequency of the electromagnetic spectrum, in other words, can be thought of as a symmetrical phase of power. We started this discussion with the idea that light traveling at 186,000 miles per second is the foundational layer within which space-time energy gravity arises. So it's a constant, and from that point of view, that constant speed creates a foundation of harmony that allows cosmos to arise. And so we can say that this constant speed of the electromagnetic spectrum is a symmetrical phase of harmony. Similarly, we can say that the range of wavelengths that are implicit in the electromagnetic spectrum as its range of possibilities is a phase or a symmetrical phase of knowledge, because as we know, considering from gamma rays down to microwaves and radio waves and so on, each of these is different in its nature and creates a foundation for different kinds of technologies to arise. And therefore, that range of wavelength can be thought of as a symmetrical phase of knowledge. And what's being predicted is that we could have a fifth property referred to as a pentic aspect that allows complexification of electromagnetic function in terms of combinations that perhaps we can't necessarily think of logically right now. And this is reflected as this symmetrical phase of convergence. So, in summary, when we consider how physics is going to be impacted, then since there is going to be a property of convergence that arises, and this property of convergence cascades in a sense through all layers, it results in quintergence as a cosmic property that allows or alters the physics of space-time energy and gravity to provide a unified embryo in which dynamics in the antecedent layers of this model of light can more fully reflect themselves. And this property of quintergence shows up as a pentic aspect in the electromagnetic spectrum and as Amaran particles at the quantum particle level, suggesting an entire change to physics. Similarly, the potential emergence of a fifth class of atoms changes chemistry as we know it. And similarly, the emergence of a fifth molecular plan changes biology as we know it. And the point here is that a model that is founded on these fourfold properties and the implicit fifth property becomes sensitive to the fourfoldness and the potential emergence of the fifth implicit property in the fivefoldness, and therefore devices that are structured to reflect this fourfold aspect and that are sensitive to the fifthfold aspect will then be able to sense the emergence of structure, of new structure in matter and life, that by definition would begin to change the physics, chemistry, and biology of target systems, which again would only be able to be sensed if the sensing mechanism had a model such as the one I've described here, implicit in its framework to begin with.